Kenny here with Gardening Simplified. Today we're going to talk a little bit about watering, how often, and what your plants might need. When it comes to watering, there's a lot of things to consider. I have heard or seen people ask that question, how often should I water? How often should I water? Well, that's going to depend on a lot of factors. One factor would be your soil type. Now for me, I have sand. It's maybe a little sandy loam, and the water seems to come out of it pretty quick, especially when we haven't had a lot of rain. And like last night, we had a freeze, which I had some of my things covered. But when you have real cold weather, you have to realize that it's just like when you go out and you look at a pond or you look at a lake when it's really cold and you see all that moisture coming off it because the ground's a little warmer, the air's a little dry, and so it takes a little bit more moisture out of your soil. Now, just because it's not a warm season doesn't mean that you can get by without watering those plants, because when it comes to watering, it's going to depend on your soil. Now, the top of my soil here is compost, and in most places it's 1 inch to 2 inches. Occasionally it works down to it's a little bit thinner than that, but most of the time it's at least 1 inch to 2 inches, sometimes a little bit more. And I water just like right now when I have young plants or plants starting out. I have a drip system, but with the long span that we had without any rain, a drip system doesn't really work well, because what happens is it just waters just close to the hose, and the ground below it, the water table is really low because you haven't had water. So what's going to happen is it's going to be drawn away from your plants. And you might think, oh, well, I'm watering a lot. I'd turn on my drip system for 6 hours, and these are these emitters that's on here is half a gallon an hour or a gallon an hour. Most of them is a gallon an hour or 0.8, but I run it at a higher pressure, so they're a gallon or more. Well, that's a lot of water when you have your emitters 6 inches apart and you're watering for 6 hours. But what happens is the plants don't really get it when it's dry. They're just having to work so hard. Your air's dry, you don't get moisture out of it, you don't get your dews in the morning and stuff like that. So that's something you want to consider. When I went back to watering overhead, and it does take time, my plants grow a lot better, they're a lot healthier, they're not stressed, so bugs don't come in and attack them as often. And everything just works out more. So when it comes to watering, don't ask someone else how long it's going to take, because or how much water it's going to take, how often you got to water. There are some plants that, like you would probably grow inside, that's say aloe vera or something like that. Don't you just love when your hose kinks up? But when you have a plant like that, you won't want to water it very often. But that's not like being out in your garden. When you're out in your garden, they say stick your finger down, and you ought to have it fill some water a couple knuckles deep. You ought to fill some water down there. Well, mine soil does doesn't do that way. It doesn't. You don't feel it. I can water in the morning, and of course this compost is more like a. We start going down now. We might find a little bit of moisture down there, just starting out. But when I'm starting out a plant, just like my little peas over there, and the moisture's way down there, it makes them really strained to get to going. And plus, if the pea's setting up at a 1/2 inch deep and it's dry, then they're not gonna take and germinate and start growing. So be aware of that. I always like to, when I have transplants or when I'm germinating seeds, I like to keep the ground moist. I like to water a couple times a day. And then when I'm, now this hadn't been watered, and you can tell it got water a few days ago because we finally got about 5/8 of an inch of rain. But you can tell when it's not been watered. You can see it gets hydrophobic, and the water just doesn't want to absorb. It wants to kind of sit on top. And so what you got to do is you got to water it regular to make it to where it's not hydrophobic anymore. You got to water it in the morning, water it in the evening. Make sure it stays moist, and it'll slowly get to where it takes water. And that way, when you have a rain, because this right here, if it has a rain, some of it'll soak in because the rain's not hard. But if you get a hard rain, it starts running off, and you might get a 1/2 inch in a half an hour or less. But most of that water won't go into the ground. So be aware of that. Learn to recognize when you water, what your soil looks like. Like I say, you can see if it's pulling on top and ain't just soaking in. Or especially if you're container gardening and you're watering in a pot and the water just goes on through the pot because you have plenty of airspace, but your media in your pot, your soil, whatever you want to call it, is hydrophobic. And so what you end up with is a situation where even though you're watering it, nothing's happening. But a situation like this bed here, this bed has spinach planted in it. And when you have something like that planted and you're not real good and moist, it is just a little bit of moisture up there. But if you're not real good and moist, and then you wonder why your plants aren't coming up. So you can't just put your seeds out and let them go. But anyway, maybe I rambled a little bit too much. But I hope you understand a little bit more about watering and to where you can make your own decisions on how to water your garden or your containers. And if you want to see more of my videos, well, hit that subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be notified. Give it a big thumbs up. Happy gardening.